Okay, find the x-intercepts. That's the same as find the roots. That's the same as find the zeros. And you need to know that the most important process with quadratics is finding the solutions, of course. The x-intercepts, the zeros, the roots. And what do? You start by trying to factor it and then use the zero product property. If it won't factor, like this one won't, then what do you do if it won't factor? Quadratic formula. Go ahead. Do the quadratic formula on this one. The very first time you did it, I would want you to write that out, but now I wouldn't. I'd expect you to just go right, drop the numbers right into the formula in your head. And I think you're going to find that there's a negative underneath the square root. And that shouldn't stop you, though. In the old days, you'd say, oh, well, then there's no solutions. But now you know how to use I. I'm going to pause for a second while you try to work this one out. All right, here's where we would put in negative b. Everybody did that, right? Pretty much. And that's going to be opposite of b, which would be positive 2. Plus or minus the square root of b squared, which is 4, minus 4 times 1 times 2, all over 2 times 1, which is 2. So then this part wasn't that big of a deal this time. 4 minus 8 is negative 4. And then the simplifying is the part that killed everybody. That's why I've been doing this so long on that top 20 sheet. Would you please, if you made a mistake up to here, try your simplifying, just start over again and see if you simplify it right? Because most people were not, well, actually, about half and half. Half the people had simplified it right, half didn't. See if you can be confident about your answer. Let me see your final opinion on what you think it is. Some people have changed their ways. That's good. All right, now almost everybody has it. Okay, good. So here's what you should have done. This is the square root of 4 and the square root of negative 1, which is 2i. So if that's 2i, then 2 goes in here once, 2 goes in here once, 2 goes in here once, and then this becomes 1 plus and minus 1i, which is just I, and divided by 1's unnecessary. So there we go, 1 plus or minus I. Now, where would that be on the graph? That wouldn't be anywhere on the graph. You can't graph an imaginary thing. Okay, you know that their answers are there, but you can't graph that. Okay, this one, if we solved it, would come out with a normal answer. It would have 2 normal numbers. What does that mean? What are they? They are the x-intercepts. They would touch the x-axis. This doesn't. Yes?
Isn't it divided by -4, like 2a?
Yeah, but 2a means a is 1. I think you had a confused in your head for a second there. Okay. All right, so let's move on to this one. If we were going to graph them, I don't want to take the time to graph them because we need to save time today. If we graphed this, the one they just did had imaginaries. What do you know about that? It's not going to do what? Not going to touch the x, yeah. So if this is a U-shaped parabola, because there's no negative out front, it's a U-shaped parabola, do you get it has to be up here? It can't be down below like this, because then it would have a negative in front, right? So we know it has to be a parabola that's generally up above here, and it's not touching. If it was touching, I'd have answers. Okay, so that one's one of these kind. How about this? Right side up or upside down parabola? As in, is it a mountain or a U shape? That would be a mountain shape. Now, do you get, if that one does have answers, that it can't be down below here? All right, and actually, when you're all done with it, you'd find that that one had 2 answers, -1 and 3. Get how I made my parabola go through -1 and -3? Okay, that had 2 normal solutions. How do you get them? You start by trying to factor it. Everybody, try to factor that. If you're skilled at factoring, you probably get a nice, easy, quick answer. Don't try to do it all at once. If you're going to factor out the negative, don't try to make two sets of parentheses right away. Factor out the negative and just see what you get. Negative comes out, and you have x squared plus 4x, like this, plus 3. See what I did there? You don't want to try to do two sets of parentheses right away. You just want to take a negative out of everything. Then you can do two sets of parentheses. Final answer, x plus 1, x plus 3. True? All right. That is equal to 0, right? Because if we want the x-intercepts, we want the y to equal 0. So then your answers are negative 1 and negative 3. If it factors, it's so easy. What if it doesn't factor? I want this to be like automatic response, just like if I say the x-intercept is where what? Y equals 0. Okay, that's an automatic response for you now, which is great. If it won't factor, then what? Quadratic formula. If it won't factor, then quadratic formula. Okay? I'm going to say it, you respond it. If it won't factor, quadratic formula. Okay. Because if it factored, you're already done. See, it factored. Yay, I got my answers. Why would I want to do the quadratic formula now? I already have the answers. But if it won't factor, what? Quadratic formula. Those of you who are refusing to say it, you're not going to remember it. Joke's on you. Okay. Now find the x-intercepts. All right, the x-intercepts are going to be where it touches, right? Well, there's several ways. The x-intercepts are where y equals 0, so you could set these equal to 0 and then factor it. And what if it doesn't factor? Quadratic formula. Okay, good. We already factored that one. This one, how the heck do you factor that? Some people think it is already factored. It's not. The first thing you'd have to do is multiply it all the way out, and then you could see if it factored. And if it didn't factor, then you use quadratic formula. Wouldn't it be easier to just graph it? I want you to just graph that one for me. You should know where its vertex is. You should know the only thing that's happened to it is a flip, a reflection. So it should be easy to graph that. What's the vertex? Come on, what? And graph it. It'll be easy. The vertex is negative 2, comma 1. And now I'm going to graph that spot. Negative 2, comma 1. There it is. And then it's an upside down parabola. I know because of the negative out front. So then, instead of going like this, I'm getting parabola that way, I'm instead going to go this way and go upside down. And over 2 and down 4. There we go. Raise your hand if you had it right. Okay. And what did you just find? The what's? X-intercepts, also known as the zeros, also known as the roots. Good. Solutions. You solved it. Because these answers right here are the zeros. If you plug them into this equation, it'll make the equation equal 0. Because if we set y equal to 0, we're finding the x-intercepts. All right, enough of that. Let's talk about the difference between these two. The square root of 16 is what? To say it. 4. It is not also negative 4. That's a really common misunderstanding. All right, this other one. X squared is equal to 16. That one needs a square root on both sides. And the square root of 16, we already said, is 4. So now what's the square root of x squared? Not x. And we've talked this through with you several times, but I'm going to remind you again. The square root of x squared is the absolute value of x, and I want to prove it to you. All right, so if the square root of x squared was equal to x, then if I were to graph it, if I graph that, y equals the square root of x squared, then if it comes out looking like this, like y equals x, then it is. The square root of x squared is x, but it doesn't. The square root of x squared doesn't look like y equals x. The square root of x squared looks like the absolute value of x, just like I was telling you. And I'm going to prove it. Here's the graph of y equals x. Here's a graph of y equals the square root of x squared. Is this equal to this? Well, are the graphs the same as each other? No. So are they really equal to each other? No. Okay. So what is the square root of x squared? That's this one right here. What is the square root of x squared? It's supposed to be absolute value. Doesn't that look like an absolute value? Yeah, it actually is. So y equals the absolute value of x is the answer to that. So why does that even matter? Because when you're up here and you do the square root of x squared, Mr. T, can you shut that door, please? They do the square root of x squared, you get absolute value of x. That leads you to two different answers here. It leads to both x equals 4 and x equals negative 4. Because, think about it, if I put a negative 4 in here, absolute value of that is positive 4. If I put a positive 4 in here, it also works. All right, that leads me to a few of these. Do you remember these from the top 20? You break it into two things, solve it, you get two answers. Go ahead, do it. Make two equations. Yes, you have to add some space on your paper if you need to. We've been doing this. I've assigned you this problem exactly at least 12 times. Because it's always been on the top 20. Some of you have been shortcutting it and doing it some cheat way in your head. That means that you don't know what to do when the problem is more complicated. But all right, so here's what you should do. You write exactly what you see right here. Then you write the exact same thing except with a negative right there. Then I solve those two equations. So I'm going to subtract 3 from both sides. X equals negative 1. Subtract 3, x equals, notice this, be careful with that. A lot of people go, oh, well, two negatives makes it positive. No, negative 2 minus 3 makes negative 5. So you get negative 1 and negative 5. Raise your hand if you had that one right. Okay, try this one now. X minus 7 equals 1. Solve it. Give me the two answers. Give me the two equations. Solve the two equations. Don't do this in your head, or you're going to not get it when it gets more complicated. Write both the equations out. Turn my way when you've got it. Here's what you should have done. You should have split it up into x minus 7 equals 1 and x minus 7 equals negative 1. And you don't try to do them in your head. You'll just make mistakes. Add 7. Add 7. I know you can all do 1 plus 7. So everybody had the 8 right. Plus 7 plus 7. Don't try to just do it in your head. Go, okay, well, negative 1 plus 7. Oh, yeah, that's going to be positive answer because there's more positives than negatives. Positive 6. That's the one that everybody was messing up. Not everybody. A lot of people had it right. Okay. Notice there's not always one positive and one negative answer. You know what I'm saying? There's two things that would work here. 8 and 6. And if you put in the 8, see, 8 minus 7 is 1. It worked. If I put in a 6, wait a minute, how does a 6 work? It's supposed to be negative 1, because it's the absolute value of that makes it positive 1. All right, one more time. Solve it. Those of you who have been just doing it in your head, good luck now. Nice. Yep. Yep. Yes. 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 You got your negatives in the wrong spot. No, wait, I'm wrong. Zoom in on it more. You're okay. Yep, that's fine. Good. Okay. There's, man, so many ways people can write these, but there's a, yes. Most of you, in fact, I think everybody's been right so far. That's a really good sign. Yes. Except there's pluses. Yes. 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 All right, so you should have done x minus m equals p, and x minus m equals negative p. Then you add m to both sides, and you see why there's a plus? Because p plus m is your answer. And you adding m, negative p plus m. Okay, now we're going to understand why we needed to know that. If you're going to solve this one, you could graph it. That's the slow way. You could use quadratic formula, because that you could use factoring, except you can't factor that yet. You don't know how to do that yet. So if it doesn't factor, you could use quadratic formula, or you could get the clump alone. This is the clump. To get it alone, I go minus 4, and I have x squared equals negative 4. Everybody write that. Now, do you get that all you have to do is take the square root and you got it? Square root. Square root. Absolute value of x. So important. And then what's the square root of negative 4? We just learned that yesterday. Not just 2. 2i. And now it's almost done. Solve that. Make two equations. They're identical except for one little negative sign. X equals 2i. And identical. See, remember, you just write exactly what you see. X equals 2i. And then you write the same exact thing, except what? A negative. Here's my two answers. X equals 2i. X equals negative 2i. You couldn't have got that by graphing. Why? If you graphed it, would you be able to see the imaginary roots? No, because you won't see where it touches. Your graph must be like up here somewhere. In fact, it is, because it's a parabola shifted up 4. So I could move it up a little bit, about like that. All right. So it wouldn't have touched, so I couldn't have got these answers any other way, except the quadratic formula would have worked. Remember, the quadratic formula can solve anything. And would I have still gotten plus and minus 2i? Yep. I would have just done it with the quadratic formula and got the same thing. All right, this one, get the clump alone. This is the clump. Get the clump alone. Hopefully you knew that meant to subtract 36. X plus 2 squared equals negative 36. Now we get to square root it. Square root, square root. Now here's the part. This is why I kept practicing these with you. Now you have absolute value of x plus 2. 6i. Why? Because when you take the square root of a variable, you get the absolute value of it. And now it's another one of those little absolute value questions. Solve this. Make me the two equations that you get. I'm going to pause for a second while you try that. Done. Here's what you should have done. X plus 2 equals 6i. And the identical thing, x plus 2 equals 6i. But you don't just write the same exact thing twice. That'd be dumb. Make that one negative. Okay? Then you subtract 2 from both sides. X equals 6i minus 2. And subtract 2 from both sides. This is the part where you got to grind this out. X equals negative 6i minus 2. If you try to do this in your head, you will pretty much not do it right. You need to show your work. I know some of you could probably still do it in your heads, but you're just putting off the day because you'll eventually hit ones you can't do in your head. So learn how to do it. All right. I'm going to show you that this can be solved in two different ways by making you solve it in two different ways. This one on the left, I want you to solve it. It's a quadratic. Your first thought should be, oh, I can factor it. Or, if the factoring doesn't work, what? Quadratic formula. If factoring doesn't work, quadratic formula. Okay, but there's also get the clump alone. That's 3 ways. But I'll tell you, when you try to factor this one, it won't work. Okay, so factoring's out. So if you can't factor, what? 4th time today. Quadratic formula. Go ahead and use a quadratic formula to solve it. And then when you're done with the quadratic formula way, get the clump alone. And by the way, the b is 0. Since there is no b term, it's -0 plus or minus the square root of 0 squared minus 4 times 3 times -18. Whew, nasty. All over 2a, which is 2 times 3, which is 6. Now, I will help you with this. That's 216. So you don't have to get a calculator out. 4 times 3 times 18 is 216. No calcs. You won't be able to use calcs on this anyway. The clump alone way, you're going to add 18 to both sides. You don't take the square root yet. You got to get the clump all the way alone. And then you can take the square root. Finish it off. I'm going to pause for a second while you do. So here's how you finish this. Divide by 3, divide by 3. X squared equals, hopefully you didn't make the same mistake I did last hour and thought it was 9. 18 divided by 3 is really what? 6. Square root. Hopefully you knew it was absolute value of x. It's not just square root of 6 then. It's 2 things. X equals plus the square root of 6 and x equals negative square root of 6. Could you say plus and minus on the square root of 6? Yeah. So there's 2 answers. Square root of 6, negative square root of 6. How many had that right? Okay, now, if you had that right and you left this alone, oops, because aren't they supposed to be the same thing? Aren't we solving the same stinking problem? So what that means is that square root of 216 simplifies. It actually has the square root of 36 times the square root of 6, because that way, when you divide it by 6, you get how that's going to cancel that, and I still have plus and minus on my answer. All right, I know this is challenging stuff. This is not super easy, but you're done. You've made it through. All I have to do from here is show you one neato trick. Okay, remember how I said you factor it first? I hope you remember this kind. X plus 10, x minus 10. I know my answers already. They're super easy. What are they? 10 and negative 10. If it hadn't factored, what would I have done? Quadratic formula. Okay, so there's the methods that you could use to solve it, except I'm missing one. Factor it, quadratic formula, and what's the new one I taught you about the weird, funny sounding clump? Get the what? Get the what? Get the clump alone. Okay, get the clump, that's the clump, get the clump alone. Add 100 to both sides, x squared equals 100. Would you rather solve this, or would you rather solve the quadratic formula? I'd rather solve this. Really easy, isn't it? Okay, so if it factors, that's an awesome way to do it. That's still the best. Okay, that's one of the reasons we practice factoring so much, because it's really, really handy. If it doesn't factor, though, quadratic formula. If you don't want to go to the quadratic formula, sometimes you can get the clump alone. That's the clump. I got it alone. I just have to square root on both sides. Have to know its absolute value of x. And then I go x equals positive 10, x equals negative 10. There's my 2 answers. Now, could I have done it in 3 ways? Yep, I could have done these quadratic formulas my 3rd way. This quadratic formula is x equals negative b. There's no b. Plus or minus the square root of b squared. There's no b. Minus 4ac, oops, I need a minus in there, minus 4 times 1 times negative 100 all over 2a all over 2. Okay, so then that means positive 400 plus and minus the square root of 400 all over 2. What does the square root of 400 break into? Root 4 and root 100, which would be like 2 root 100, which would be like 2 times 10, which would be like 20. Oh, square root of 400 is 20. Cool. What's 20 divided by 2? 10. That's why it's plus and minus 10. So quadratic formula works. Get the clump alone works. Or factoring would have worked. All right. Now, you should be able to factor this one then in about 30 seconds and tell me, not 30, not that one. Let's go with that. There. You should be able to factor that in like 10 seconds and say, oh, the answer is this and this. Boom, boom. That's supposed to be squared. Sorry. Did you get x plus 2 and x minus 2, and therefore what are the answers? 2 and negative 2. If factoring hadn't worked, what could I have used? Quadratic formula. And what's the last option? Get the clump alone. So I'd add 4 to both sides and then take the square root of it. All those ways work. Okay? Now, what if it's plus? We've told you before that those don't factor. But they do if you use imaginaries. Everybody try to factor this using imaginaries, and I bet you 3 or 4 of you are just going to come up with it. Like, oh, but it's this. Turn it my way, I'll tell you if you're right or not. Get on a blank page so I can actually see the answer. There you go, that'll be good enough. We're making factors, 2 sets of parentheses. Well, maybe you should start. If you're lost, make that a minus and see what would have factored to that. Hopefully that's easy. The only difference is this is a plus, and we need to use imaginaries somehow. I don't want the answers. I want the factors. You're really close. But yours, the middle terms would not cancel. That's it. Yes. You have one imaginary, but you don't have the other imaginary. Also, same with you. Yes, that's what I was looking for. Very close. It's just when you do your outside and your inside, they wouldn't cancel at this point. You need the outside and the inside numbers to cancel. First outside, inside, last, you know? Yes, that's it. That's it. You're missing one of your imaginaries. You got one imaginary answer, you don't have the other. Yes. 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 Yes, now we're getting that popcorn effect where everybody's getting them right. X plus something and x minus something. I hope you know that. And then, how on earth can that be true? If you use imaginaries. Watch this. 2i and 2i. Here's why it works. Some people are like, server, if you take that times that, you don't get that. Yes, you do. Watch. 2i times negative 2i. That makes negative 4i squared. What's I squared? Negative 1. Negative 4 times I squared is really negative 1. So what's negative 4 times negative 1? Positive 4. That's what we wanted, right? We wanted to get a positive 4. This works because the first outside, inside, last actually multiplies out to x squared plus 4. The first obviously make x squared. That part's easy. And the outside and the inside obviously cancel because one's positive, one's negative. The only question was making these lasts right here. Negative 2i times positive 2i. And I just showed you. You take negative 2i times positive 2i. You get negative 4i squared, which makes negative 4 times negative 1, which makes positive 4. It actually works. So the moral of the story is, if you had to solve this one with imaginary numbers, you could solve it with get the clump alone. Get the clump along, subtract 100 from both sides, take the square root, you have square root of negative 100. Or you could factor it. You can even factor this. So tell me what the two answers are. I'll give you a hint. Your answers are like 2i and negative 2i, something like that. Tell me what the two answers are. First you factor it. You got it factored. That's good. Now just tell me what the answers are. You've got it factored, but what are the answers? That's what I was looking for. Nice job. Yes, that's it. That's it. You've got the factoring, but I need the answers. You got it. And you've got it. And you've got it. You've got it. Nice job. That's it. Yep. Yep. Can you tilt yours up a little higher? I can't see the. Oh, is that a 1? No, I get it. It's just kind of written funny. Yes. You got one of your two answers. You need two answers. You got it factored right. Now, what are the two answers? Which means you just like two simple numbers. One's positive, one's negative. Yes. 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 Okay, you got x plus 10i, x minus 10i. Oopsie. 10i. And then, first outside into last, all works. And the answers are x equals 10i and x equals negative 10i. Why? Because really what you're doing is setting this part here equal to 0. X plus 10i has to equal 0. And this part right here equal to 0. X minus 10i equals 0. And then you solve them both. X equals negative 10i. X equals positive 10i. There's your two answers. Now, could I have gotten that with quadratic formula? Yes. Quadratic formula always works. It's an awesome thing. Could I have done it by getting the clump alone? Yep. Here's why we don't teach you get the clump alone right away. Try to get the clump alone now. You can't. What part messes it up? The 2x part messes it up. But what always works? Quadratic formula. What's easier than the quadratic formula? Factoring, which we also call the ZPP, because when it's done, it looks like that. It's zero product multiplying to 0. All right, that's a summary of a lot of stuff. You've learned a lot of stuff. Your assignment today, because we don't have as much time to work on it as homework, is to do the evens on today's homework. So I want you to find the homework, and if there's problems that have like A, B, C, D that you're assigned, like if it's problem 2 and you're supposed to do the evens, you can do the even letters, which are, of course, not A. A is not the even letter, because A is the first one, right? So B is an even letter. Learned all kinds of things today. D is an even letter. Okay, that's all I got for you for today.